Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm continuing the discussion and analysis into human rights. Specifically, in the discussion, I'm going to be looking at human rights in reference to food as a human right. So we're going to look at food security issues. We're going to talk about sort of the sustenance of food, the allocation of food, resources. I'm not going to get into like an agricultural sort of account of the development of food. I actually do that in a book that my wife and I submitted for publication earlier, and I'm going through the final proofs. It's already been accepted for publication. The reviews have gone through and everything. And in that I go into a much more detailed sort of discussion on the notion of food as a human right and the global responsibility to secure food globally. I'm not going to get into that much detail in this analysis because specifically I want to tailor it for the human rights lecture. So with that being said, we're going to be on page 21 of the notes. My notes, again, for those of you who are just watching now, click the banner ad as it pops up. It'll take you to the PDF. Download the PDF. You can follow along, or the link in the description field. And with that, let's begin. Alright, so this is Human Rights, Section 7. And specifically we're going to be looking at George Kent, his analysis in the book that we're using, Human Rights in the World Community. Food is a human right. And this is page 191 through 200. And we're going to be looking at food. Food is a human. I think food security issues, food as a human right, is very, very important. It's very seldomly discussed in accounts of human rights. And again, in selecting what topics I was going to incorporate into the lecture series, I didn't want to do sort of what had already been done, though there are of the utmost importance, civil rights being a minorities important, feminist concerns, women's rights of concern. I wanted to do topics that weren't as popular, quote unquote, with respect to the contemporary sort of literature and pedagogical discussion of these rights. So, human rights. Let's begin with a quote from the book. The quote is, quote, this is in the middle of page 21 in the notes. The human right to adequate food is explicitly recognized as a part of the broader human rights to an adequate standard of living. Right, so when we talk about adequacy of food, we recognize that having adequate food is synonymous with having an adequate standard of living. Right? Adequate food is important. Why? Because we need to recognize the relationship between having enough to eat and having sort of a minimum basic standard of living. The discussion, I can go off on a brief tangent. I don't want to go off too deep or too complex because I didn't factor it into the notes. But underlying this discussion as sort of a foundational account prior to this discussion even is the sort of moral consideration between the quality versus the sanctity of life, right? So that I'm not going to get into any depth to this. This is just to put it out there and you can do research on your own. But you have variations between those who argue for the quality, Q-U-A-L, quality versus S-A-N-C-I-T-Y. Quality versus sanctity of life, right? Sanctity of life, theorists say that life is sacred as such, right? Life is in and of itself sacred. And under no circumstances is it permissible, and I'm generalizing here, for life to be willfully exterminated. Suicide is condemned, pro-choice is condemned, euthanasia is condemned, so on. Quality of life theorists look at exactly what it says, the quality of the life. And this becomes more subjective. So you have a subjective interpretation of the value of life, an objective interpretation of the value of life. life is objectively valuable insofar as an individual human being is alive, even in a coma. This is the quality of life theorists say, well, quality, and this is a huge generalization super quick, just so that you get an idea. Quality of life theorists say, no, it's not just about having life and being alive. It is a subjective concern, and each individual moral agent makes his or her own assessments on if life is worth living any longer. So the distinctions between quality and sanctity. With respect to adequate food and adequate standards of living, you can see that we are teetering between sort of a quality versus sanctity. Enough in order to objectively sustain my livelihood, but also there is a subjective element in this, and this is where it gets complicated, especially in discussion of rights. Because if we're talking about a right to have adequate food, then there's an obligation, a corresponding obligation, and we're going to try and locate that in a little bit. So, to understand this, we need to address the escalating food crisis. Right, the escalating food crisis. And the first point is that the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon led a task force to tackle the global food crisis, right? The global food crisis. And I think I said earlier in the series, strategically and specifically, United Nations and Ban Ki-moon have explicitly stated that the three crises facing the 21st century are going to be the food crisis, the development crisis, and climate crisis, climate change. Right? And these crises are fundamentally going to threaten the stability economically, socially, culturally, escalations of violence, threats, and the more these crises unravel, the more they start to affect broader portions of the global population, is the more threat they present. And it's absolutely right. You can immediately recognize that in acts of desperation, if whole communities are on the verge of starvation, their population is going to be desperate in order to survive, right? So obviously this desperation fuels violence both inter and intra-state. So food security is actually a very important part, though probably seldom if ever discussed, part of both international and national security, right? Food security is an essential part, right? So the global food crisis is the first point, right? We have to recognize the ensuing global food crisis, obviously because of water shortages, desertification, and so on. Later I'll talk about other reasons for the food crisis that are again, seldom if ever reported. Second, what's important to recognize is sort of the slogan, like food first. And the idea with food first, this reflects the international importance placed on the adequacy in food rights, right? Food as a human right. With respect to the notion of food first, the idea, in a very sort of general sense, is we can't really talk about all of the other rights that human beings the globe over are entitled to if the human beings under consideration don't have access to proper nourishment, including clean water, which is a huge problem, right? Which is an enormous problem. So in combination with clean drinking water, having access to adequate food rights it's essential, right? It's essential, and it's something, unfortunately, that many people within the West take for total granted, right? It is a global epidemic. It is a global problem, and food scarcity is and does threaten to undermine both international and national security, wherever your home might be, right? Any government is threatened by the lack of securing proper food for its population. All right, so that's number two. So we have to put food first. Number three, this is an important point. The analysis of food rights takes place within the broader human right to adequate standard of living, right? This discussion takes place within that broader analysis, as I said, right? So that within sort of an adequate standard of living discussion, we're not, and actually I probably shouldn't say it's equal to, it's actually a subset of, to be technical. Right? So if we have a standard of living here, D-A-R-D of living, Then we have food